Hello, I'm Katrina Murleys-Black, Research Director at the Law and Justice Foundation, New South Wales, and this presentation provides an overview of conducting client satisfaction surveys with a specific focus on the legal assistance sector. This presentation is 35 minutes long. Shown here are the approximate times at which the main topics are each covered. So why conduct client satisfaction surveys? Yes, you probably already know what some clients think some of the time, but are those clients really representative of all clients? Probably not if they volunteered their views or if they are particularly grateful for the help received. In these situations, clients tend to say what they think you want to hear. It is correct that satisfaction rates for most services, particularly free ones, are generally very high, but it's worth digging deeper into the data. Clients who say they are very satisfied or strongly agree are indeed happy with the service overall and willing to forgive a shortcoming on an element of lower importance to them. However, fairly satisfied or agree is often intended as a polite negative response. Clients aren't that happy, but it can seem churlish to complain. One option is to include a question on a client survey asking if clients are willing to be recontacted for further research, giving the opportunity for a later small-scale study to understand what is driving those less than perfect responses. It's important to recognise that generalised satisfaction questions will also be affected by factors outside your control, particularly where a client's expectations regarding outcomes could not be met. So questions should be designed carefully to focus on those elements that can be responded to, differentiating between satisfaction with the process and satisfaction with the outcome. And finally, a robust, well-considered client survey should give you, current funders and potential future funders, confidence in the services that you provide. So what is satisfaction? We know it when we experience it, but satisfaction is not a single-dimensional construct and is entirely dependent on the expectations people have of a service. Angela here is happy with the service she received. She's pleased she could access a building, that she only waited 30 minutes, and that the lawyer was friendly and sympathetic. Asma felt stressed about seeking help, which only built while she waited nearly an hour for her call to be answered. But then everything went smoothly. She was treated with respect and given clear guidance on next steps. Her overriding feeling was one of relief. Alan wanted a quick answer to his questions from a trustworthy source and achieved his aim. Each of these clients would describe themselves as satisfied, but their expectations, service experience, and how they felt at its conclusion were all quite different. In designing client surveys, it is therefore important to assess the expectations that clients bring with them and what aspects of the service are important to them. For instance, waiting times are easily measured but may have a negligible impact on satisfaction overall, particularly if the quality of the rest of the service exceeds or falls short of expectations. Not everything that determines a client's satisfaction is within the control of the service provider, so the focus should be on measuring those aspects of the service that something can be done to improve. That said, understanding external factors that impact satisfaction can be useful in understanding why satisfaction rates vary between clients and therefore between providers. It's also worth considering what an optimal level of service would look like to a client. That is, what aspects of the service you provide do they need to have a good experience of to help you achieve your intended outcomes? For example, in your context, waiting times may be crucial to supporting clients in a time-sensitive context. Identifying the important elements of a service experience should ideally involve the clients themselves in co-design activities. Research has identified that there are many elements to customer or client satisfaction. Tangibles relate to the physical facilities, such as ease of access, the comfort and cleanliness of waiting rooms and offices, how easy it was to hear staff on a telephone line, or how well the video conferencing worked. Reliability is about the consistency of service standards, that as a client you get the same standard of service on each contact, and that promises to take further action are always followed through. Responsiveness encompasses waiting times and service availability, and, if relevant, how quick staff are to respond to messages, for instance. Assurance is about perceptions of trust in the service provider and in the quality of the service that they provide. Care by staff incorporates all the interactional elements, from showing courtesy and respect to communicating information clearly. Recovery only applies when things go wrong. How are missed appointments, delays, and client complaints handled? When designing client satisfaction questions, consider which of these are important in your own context. When asking clients the questions covering your chosen elements of service provision, you will need to provide a response scale. The best response scale will vary depending on the question being asked, though it's easiest for clients if a consistent response scale is used for most questions. Some examples are provided here. Always make sure the scale is balanced with the same number of positive as negative options so that you don't skew the findings in one direction or the other. There's no agreement on the best number of options and whether a neutral midpoint such as neither agree nor disagree should be provided. Depending on the questions asked, an additional don't know, too soon to say, or doesn't apply to me option might also be required. For self-completion questions, whether on paper or online, a visual representation of the scale is helpful for everyone, but particularly those with limited English reading skills. However, make sure you are consistent. Don't provide a written scale for some clients and visuals for others, as they will be interpreted differently. There are 7 questions that are required for inclusion in client surveys under the Australian National Legal Assistance Partnership NLAP agreement for 2020 to 25. They each use a strongly agreed, strongly disagree scale with no neutral option. The wording and placement of these in a questionnaire should be consistent in all client surveys so that they can be used to monitor trends in satisfaction over time or to compare different client cohorts. Even small changes to wording, placement, or response scale options can affect comparability. However, there is no problem with asking clients additional questions after these in the questionnaire. So unless it's necessary to keep the questionnaire very short, this would be an efficient way of gathering locally relevant information. The length of a survey should balance the burden on participants with the increased value that additional data collected may give to your survey findings. However, how many questions to include will depend not only on what you want to know, but also the resources you have available to analyse the data you collect, and indeed on how the survey is being conducted, a point I'll return to. Even in a short survey, perhaps just focused on asking the NLAC questions, try and collect some information about the client. Sometimes, depending on how the sample of clients was drawn, this can be collected by linking to administrative records. However, clients should be asked permission to link data, and there's no guarantee it was correctly entered. For these reasons, we recommend including at least some key socio-demographic questions in the questionnaire. If space is very tight, at least include postcode, as linking postcode to the ABS Socioeconomic Indexes for Areas, or CEFA, will give a profile of the relative disadvantage of participants' geographic area of residence, as well as potentially providing information on service accessibility. We also recommend giving clients the opportunity to provide feedback in their own words, and a question on whether they would be willing to participate in further research. Even a small number providing responses to these last 2 questions can be valuable. For a 5 to 10-minute survey, there will be time to ask additional socio-demographic questions, such as those listed here. Unless a survey is taking place face-to-face, 20 to 30 minutes is the maximum recommended length of a questionnaire to avoid too many respondents dropping out before reaching the end. Such a long survey is not required for purely monitoring purposes, but a survey of this length gives the scope to explore more issues and add to knowledge about clients and their needs. For example, a longer questionnaire could explore details of the legal problem, including how long it's been going on, the impact it's had, and whether or not it is resolved or finalised by the time of the survey. For resolved and finalised problems, questions could explore the nature of the resolution or the reasons why the client was not expecting to take any further action. For a deeper understanding of the service experience, clients can be asked explicitly how their experience compared to their expectations on a range of service criteria, whether they perceive their next steps as being informed by the service they received, including whether they were given and took up any referrals, and whether they attribute any outcome achieved to the assistance provided. Unless questions are mandated and pre-tested, some type of piloting or trial of the questionnaire is recommended. This will identify whether some clients have problems understanding questions or interpret them differently than intended. Some questions may be too difficult or cause distress. These issues can best be identified by interviewing a small number of clients face-to-face, even for questionnaires that will eventually be completed by clients themselves. Listen carefully to their responses and ask them why they gave a particular response. This process is called cognitive interviewing. Many questionnaires include some routing questions so that clients are only asked questions that are relevant to them. A test ensures this routing is working correctly. Testing can also identify where errors of completion may occur and provides information on how long the survey will take to complete. While some aspects of testing can initially be done on colleagues, testing on a small number of clients is necessary to identify the impacts of literacy and the client perspective on question understanding and interpretation. The order in which questions are asked and the exact way a question is worded, including the response options available to respondents, will affect survey findings. This is why it is important to keep questionnaire changes to a minimum when the findings of two surveys will be compared, such as those covering different time periods. Consistency is particularly important in the questions used to group clients according to their socio-demographic status. For example, a low income level or a single parent family or a person with a disability can include very different groups of people depending on exactly what question was asked. The Foundation therefore recommends using harmonized survey questions to facilitate comparisons between different data sources. The Foundation has designed some survey questions to identify priority client groups. As far as possible, these aim to use similar definitions to the Australian Bureau of Statistics census or the Legal Assistance Data Standards Manual. The survey questions are available to download from the Foundation's Access to Justice Research Hub. There are a range of ways to conduct a survey, and each has its advantages and disadvantages. These are summarized here. Paper, SMS, and online surveys are all self-completion, so save the cost of using interviewers. But the response rate and quality of responses will not be as great as for telephone or in-person interviews. Telephone surveys are best conducted by a trained field force and can be a good compromise between cost and quality. In-person or face-to-face interviews generally provide the best quality information as the interviewer can ask more questions and probe for more detailed answers. However, they are less suitable for sensitive topics that may benefit from a more confidential method. Unless the client survey is built into ongoing monitoring or collection of information on client outcomes, it is generally not necessary to include all clients in the sample, and to do so may be an unnecessary burden on clients. Other than self-completion electronic surveys, the larger the sample, the larger the cost. What is more important is that the clients that do participate are representative of all clients. This means the profile of clients surveyed in terms of service types, area of law, mode of service delivery, location of service, etc., should be a reasonable match for all clients, referred to as the population. To achieve this, it may be necessary to stratify the sample, that is, to separately sample clients receiving different types of service. I'll say more about this shortly. It's important to consider whether there is anything about the way the survey has been designed that might inadvertently exclude some groups from participating, particularly those with restricted capability. For instance, what about people whose first language is not English, or who have a disability, or do not have internet access, or have low levels of educational attainment? Where it just isn't possible to cater for the full range of clients, this should always be noted in reports. It's tempting to issue an open invitation to all clients to participate, but clients who volunteer are unlikely to be representative of the full range of experiences. They may have had a particularly bad or good experience, or just have more time on their hands, or like me, have a strange love of surveys. Representativeness is achieved through a mechanism called random sampling. So what does random mean? Well, sadly, it doesn't mean that you can pick anyone at random. A random sample is one where every client in the population of interest, such as all clients receiving family law duty services during September 2021, has an equal or predetermined chance of being selected to participate. In a simple random sample, everyone in the population has a non-zero and known chance of being selected, whatever the service they received or their personal characteristics. For this reason, these samples are also known as probability samples. There are various methods to create random samples. The most obvious one is pulling names out of a hat. A common approach is to sort clients on some aspect that doesn't affect the service experience, such as assigning all clients a random code and sorting these from smallest to largest code. Clients are then selected at whatever interval gives you the sample size you require. For example, a sample of 10 from a list of 100 would require selecting the 1st, 11th, 21st, and so on up to the 91st. Of course, as there is simple random sampling, there is also complex random sampling. This is because a simple random sample may not be feasible or may not give sufficient sample of subgroups of interest. Clustering is an example of complex random sampling. In this type of sampling, a unit above client is randomly selected, and then clients are randomly selected within that unit. So going back to our duty lawyer example, there may be duty lawyer sessions at 20 courts, but sampling from all of these is too onerous. A random 10 courts could be selected, and then clients randomly selected from each of those. Deciding how many clients to include in the survey is a balance of how precise the findings need to be and cost and practical considerations. Sometimes it may be most straightforward just to sample all clients, such as those attending an outreach event. But when only a sample of clients rather than the entire population of clients is included, it is necessary to consider that a sample may give a different finding to that of the population. For example, it may be that 80% of your population of 1,000 clients are satisfied, but in your first sample of 100 clients, only 75% say they're satisfied. Now, if you were to take multiple samples, eventually they would average the population finding of 80%. But as you only want to take one sample, we can use statistical theory to calculate how precise the findings are for a particular sample size, or how many clients must be included in the sample to ensure the findings are sufficiently precise. By precise, we mean that it is highly likely that the finding from the sample falls within a small enough range that we can draw useful conclusions about the population of clients. The good news is that for probability samples, it's possible to calculate the chance that the sample is giving you the finding for the population from which it is drawn. And the larger the sample, the more likely the finding is close to that of the actual population. That is, a larger sample gives a more precise finding. More precise findings become more important where different client groups or different service providers or different points in time are going to be compared. If a sample is too small, the range or margin of error of the estimate will not be precise enough to be useful. The bad news is that there are many factors that determine an appropriate sample size, some of which are listed here, and not all of these can be known before the survey is actually conducted, such as the proportional percentage expected to give a certain finding. And something else you can't know in advance is what proportion of clients that you ask to participate will do so. It is perfectly acceptable, therefore, to use some rules of thumb to decide on the sample size. This table shows the sample size required to be reasonably confident that the findings from your sample indicate that the true population finding lies within a certain range. With a sample of 9,500 clients expressing 50% satisfaction, you can be reasonably confident that the true population value actually lies somewhere between 49% and 51%, so that's pretty precise. However, with a sample of just 100 clients expressing 50% satisfaction, you can only be confident that the true population value is somewhere between 40% and 60%. Not very precise, but nevertheless that may still be good enough for your purposes. Sample sizes can also be smaller to achieve the same precision for more extreme findings, such as 80% satisfaction or 10% dissatisfaction. The technique of stratification also reduces the required sample size. To confuse matters further, when samples are drawn from small populations, it's also necessary to take account of the size of the population. The client population might, for instance, be all clients receiving a duty service in a 4-week period. Smaller populations will require a greater proportion to be included in the sample for a prescribed level of precision, but the absolute number will also be smaller. This table gives an indication of the number of clients that should participate in a survey to achieve either a plus or minus 5% margin of error, such as a range of 45% to 55%, or the far more precise plus or minus 1%, such as the precision of 49% to 51%, and how this varies according to the size of the client population. As mentioned on the previous slide, the greater the deviation from a 50% satisfaction finding, then the smaller the sample size required. So the sample sizes indicated in this table are the safe option. And if they aren't achieved in practice, then it may not matter. Stratification is useful as a method of ensuring that the sample represents all client groups and that there is sufficient sample of subgroups of interest. It still requires random sampling of clients from within each strata, but the probability of being selected can be different for each strata. In example here, we have a telephone legal helpline service that provides information and advices, but it provides far more information than advices, 10,000 compared to 1,000. It is decided that a total sample of 440 is required. But if a simple random sample is drawn from all telephone legal helpline clients, the chances are that only about 40 of the clients selected will have received an advice service. There is interest in separately measuring client satisfaction for those receiving information and those receiving advice. But this sample of 40 is not enough to provide sufficiently precise findings for the advice clients. So instead, the sample is stratified into the two strata of information and advice. And in this example, an equal sample is then drawn from each, but it could be any predetermined proportion. In deciding which factors to stratify by, consider first what groups it is important to ensure are represented in the final sample, and second, what subgroups of clients or service types you will want to be able to report on separately. If a sample is stratified to increase the sample size of a particular subgroup relative to its proportion in the population, it's then necessary to weight the data before findings can be reported for all clients combined. Weighting adjusts the contribution of each client's responses to the overall findings. Weighting can be a complex exercise, so we would recommend assistance, but this table explains roughly how it works. The aim is to adjust the surveyed sample counts back to the profile of the population from which the samples were drawn. In this example, the data provided by each of the 220 information clients is multiplied up by 1.82, whereas the data provided by each of the 220 advice clients is multiplied down by 0.182. In the weighted sample, the clients surveyed therefore have an impact on the total findings that is proportionate to their distribution in the population of all helpline clients. You might also hear about weighting for non-response. This is often used in general population surveys to correct for differential response from subgroups, such as upweighting responses from young respondents and downweighting those from older respondents to ensure that the final sample has the same profile as the general population. This is not usually done in client surveys for a number of reasons, including that there may not be a population profile to weight to, that weighting decreases the effective sample size and thus reduces the precision of findings, that it might not be clear what the elements of the weight should be, and that non-response weighting is technically complex and best left to the experts. Of course, not everyone who's asked to participate in a survey will agree to the irresistible opportunity of providing their feedback. Generally speaking, the response rate is the number of clients that take part in the survey divided by the number of clients that were asked to participate and were eligible to do so. It is important to try and maximize response rates because this will usually minimize bias in findings. Otherwise, there is a risk that you're only hearing from those who are particularly keen to provide feedback, and they are unlikely to represent the views of all clients. Response rates are affected by the topic of the survey, and the good news is that client surveys often have higher response rates than general population surveys. Because not everyone who is asked will complete the survey, the number of clients asked to participate may need to be far larger than the sample sizes shown in the sample size picker table earlier, because these are the number of completed surveys required for findings of sufficient precision. Response rates vary markedly by how the survey is conducted. They tend to be highest for in-person surveys and lowest for postal or return later surveys. For in-person surveys, it would be wise to double the number of clients sampled, and for telephone surveys to triple it. SMS, email, postal and return later surveys will require even larger increases to the number sampled. One method used to increase response rates is to offer an incentive to the client for completing the survey. Although incentives are usually monetary, such as a gift voucher, research shows that offering any gift can increase commitment to participate. For a short survey, incentives are less likely to be required and can most effectively be targeted just on those respondents that have taken longer to respond and made an encouragement to do so, though some consider there are ethical issues with this approach. Longer surveys where there is a significant time commitment on the part of the respondent, and surveys where you are recontacting the same person on more than one occasion are likely to require a larger monetary gift to be effective. Whether incentives should be used or not remains controversial, particularly for clients that have received a free service. There is also some concern that increased use of incentives will lead to an expectation on the part of respondents of always being paid to participate in research. Despite your best efforts, you find that only a small proportion of the clients you ask to participate do so. Does that matter? A rate of around 20% is not unusual and may still be representative, though as response rates drop, this is increasingly unlikely. It may be possible to check how representative your sample is by comparing the profile of survey participants to non-participants, if this is held in administrative data. You could use this information to weight your data, though we don't recommend this. Instead, bear in mind any deviation from representativeness when interpreting and using findings. There is still value in a survey with a low response rate. Clients have all been given an opportunity to provide feedback, and those who had something to say will have said it. And indeed, these may be the most valuable responses and the ones that you most need to hear to improve services. They just can't be used as evidence of the views of all clients. Even when clients participate, they don't all answer all questions. Questions requiring clients to write a response or give an explanation for a prior response, such as, "Why do you say that?" are particularly likely to be skipped. So these questions may have a far lower response rate than the rest of the questionnaire. Nevertheless, qualitative data of this type can provide insights into the reasons behind the quantitative findings. Use anonymized quotes instead of percentages when reporting these kinds of findings. Given their limitations, client surveys should only be one source of information on how clients are experiencing services. Ideally, this information should be presented alongside other indicators and evidence such as informal feedback, complaints, and staff observations. So you have your survey ready to go, emails ready to send, or telephone interviewers poised to lift up the phone. But how should the survey be introduced to the client? It's worth agreeing a consistent wording to achieve a number of important objectives. When clients participate, they must do so with an accurate understanding of who is conducting the survey, the purpose of the survey, and what is required of them, such as how long it will take to complete. Be clear about how personal information will be used. Is the survey confidential? Will survey findings be linked to administrative data? Might some respondents be recontacted? Informed consent and reassurance regarding confidentiality both assist in increasing response rates, but motivating words will also insist. An example of some introductory wording is shown here. Also, don't forget to thank the respondent for their participation at the conclusion of the survey, and ideally remind them of who you are and how they can contact you. This gives respondents the opportunity to check the survey was bona fide if they later have doubts. This information could also facilitate clients accessing further help if participating in the survey prompts them to do so. Client surveys can take place immediately the service has concluded or any time thereafter, as long as the client is still likely to recall the details of their experience. Surveys offered immediately on conclusion of a service may hit clear to clients what service they're being asked about. An immediate survey would probably involve being handed a paper questionnaire or being texted a link, as a survey should be independent of the member of staff providing the service. Hard-to-reach clients are more likely to participate, and client privacy is maintained, as it won't be necessary to pass client details to any third party. However, as this approach requires staff to administer the survey, training on sampling and gaining participation is likely to be necessary. Another option is to send out links to online or SMS surveys a few days after the service was provided. Waiting before distributing the survey would allow you to include questions on what actions clients have taken so far and gives them time to reflect on the value and impact of the service they received. Where an independent contractor is conducting telephone interviews, practical arrangements will probably mean surveys cannot take place until at least a few days after the service was received. It is recommended to stagger providing client contact details so that no client is waiting more than a couple of weeks before they are contacted. Surveys some months later can be useful to collect information on the outcomes clients achieve, but given the increased challenges of making contact and gaining participation, we suggest this is only used as a second or follow-up to an initial survey within a couple of weeks of the original service provision. Before we move on to reporting, a reminder of the ethics of conducting surveys. First, participation should be voluntary. Receiving a survey should never be contingent on taking part in research, and no other form of coercion should be used. A guarantee of anonymity will improve the quality of feedback, and of course it must be respected. No attempt should be made to identify clients from their responses. Clients must be told the purpose of the survey and approve any linking of survey findings to other data that you hold on them. Ethics approval from an ethics committee may be required for surveys of young people, those with mental incapacity, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly where questions about health or other sensitive topics are asked. Ethics committees can provide useful feedback on survey design, but the process can be slow, so needs to be considered early in the survey development. Investing the time and resources to conduct a quality survey is important, as unfortunately a poorly designed survey that does not produce valid findings is a waste of participating clients' time and sector resources. Client surveys are generally used to monitor satisfaction levels to identify where they are less than optimal. But what is optimal? Comparing to an accepted standard is also known as benchmarking. There is no one way to identify that standard. It could, for instance, be the average performance across the whole organisation. Though as standards rise, this too will rise. When drawing comparisons of survey findings from one part of the organisation to another, it's important to take account of known variations by client group. For instance, if people for whom English is not their first language tend to report higher satisfaction levels regardless of the service they receive, then areas of the business based in geographically diverse areas may appear to be providing a better service than those elsewhere. Another consideration is that as services improve, so do clients' expectations, so it can be challenging to chase for overall improvements in satisfaction ratings. A more realistic aim might be to reduce differences in satisfaction rates between areas of the business once variations in the client mix are being controlled for. We therefore recommend benchmarking between organisations is only undertaken on the basis of good evidence of what drives satisfaction rates, as otherwise comparisons may be invalid. The survey is complete, the analysis done. So what should go in the report? Most obviously the key findings, but these will be of most value when they are presented in the context of the services provided and the implications of the findings for strategic and operational decisions about future service delivery. If the same survey has been conducted consistently over time, then data from previous sweeps could be included, ideally with exploration and explanation for any apparent trends. Findings are often of more value if they are disaggregated into groups of interest, such as differentiating by age or gender or area of law or service type. Most findings should be presented as percentages, but the count of respondents who answer the question, the denominator for the percentage calculation, should also be provided. Good practice in survey reporting should describe the method used, such as telephone or online self-completion, and allow readers to make an assessment of how generalizable the findings are to other client groups. To do this, it's important to include a description of the target client population, how they were sampled, and the characteristics of those that actually participated compared to the target population if known. Annexing a copy of the questionnaire to the report is always helpful so that the exact wording of questions is transparent, and this also facilitates sharing of questions. Finally, and most importantly, to follow through on the promise you made to survey participants that their responses would improve services, the report should include recommendations. Ideally, emerging findings will have been discussed with frontline staff, not only so that the report and any recommendations can take account of operational realities, but also as a first step in exploring potential ideas for service improvement. What could go wrong? Well, now you've watched this presentation, hopefully not much, but drawing on our own good and not so good experiences of designing and running surveys, we have identified some top tips for conducting great client surveys. This resource is downloadable from the Foundation's Access to Justice Research Hub. There are also many other useful sources of information and toolkits developed across the sector, and we've identified a few here. Please let us know about other resources you've used or found helpful so that we can share the good practice. Thank you for listening.